Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan, and we are packed to the gills with stuff to talk about this week. Barbie becoming the latest movie to cross $1 billion at the worldwide box office, the continued success of Oppenheimer and its place on a very unique chart in box office history, and I was able to land an interview with somebody at Angel Studios, the studio behind Sound of Freedom, to try to help answer some of the questions that you might have about its box office performance and just how that pay it forward system works, plus so much more. Before we get to that though, and it's just the way that things have been hitting the last couple weeks, I wanted to take a moment and recognize, and this is not a slight to anybody that I haven't recognized on the show, but recognize somebody who passed away earlier in the day on Monday as I was prepping this show, and that is director William Friedkin. William Friedkin was one of the most influential and acclaimed directors of the new American cinema of the 1970s. He influenced the action genre forever with The French Connection and its frenetic car chase. That movie won Best Picture and Best Director for Friedkin, among others. Then he influenced the horror genre forever with The Exorcist, which earned Friedkin another nomination for Best Director. Friedkin's 1977 film Sorcerer was regarded as a failure upon its release, but it too has been reevaluated in the decade since, and many consider it to be a lost masterpiece of the 1970s. And he continued to work into the 21st century, including directing a fantastic remake of 12 Angry Men, starring Jack Lemmon and George C. Scott. If you've ever heard William Friedkin talk about movies, then you understand what it is to hear someone who was passionate about film. And one of my entries into the world of film, and not just movies, was the AFI 100 Years 100 Movies special. The first one aired, I think, in 1998, and they had interviews with a bunch of different people, some great directors, actors, critics, etc. And one of them was William Friedkin, who I kind of knew that name, but I was only 15 at that time. And every time he would pop up on screen, it was like I was getting an education on how to talk about film passionately, enthusiastically, relatably, and from a well-informed perspective. Of course, Friedkin also is known to be not just a passionate defender of film itself, but of his films in particular.
It has been said that the film The Exorcist has taken the more exploitive elements of the novel and left out maybe some of the meatier aspects. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. Who said that? First, let's talk about who said it.
Okay, it has been said in some reviews.
By who?
Film critics.
Which one?
Okay, I don't have specifics with me, but that has been said.
I've never heard that.
We are at a crossroads when it comes to the movie industry, but it also kind of feels like that we are at the dawn of perhaps a new era of filmmaking. But as we enter these new eras, it means that you start to lose the masters of the previous eras. And I think it's going to be a very tough decade or so for movie fans, because we are starting to say goodbye to a generation of filmmakers who redefined what movies were and who made some of the best movies of all time. One of those directors was William Friedkin, who passed away earlier. Of course, my condolences go out to his friends, family, and fans.
To those of you out there who may want to go to film school or have a child that would like to go to film school, just watch the films of Alfred Hitchcock. That's all you need to know about how to make films. It's what I did.
Let's transition now to the box office top 5 for this past weekend, August 4th through the 6th, 2023. And of course, no surprise, Barbie remained on top with another great hold, dropping just 43%. So that is 2 weekends in a row with a sub 50% drop. I know that some people out there were predicting huge drops for Barbie once the audience found out what the movie was actually about. Well, it seems like the audience is pretty happy with what the movie's about. $53 million in week 3. That's what some people thought the movie might open to just a few short weeks ago. Barbie now has a domestic gross of $459.3 million. That puts it amongst the 25 highest grossing films of all time domestically, unadjusted for inflation. We have a lot more to talk about with Barbie. Meg 2, The Trench, was able to win a very close race for second place. It came in at just over $30 million, which, considering how many sequels this summer have not done well, I have to admit is a pretty good performance. I was not a huge fan of the film, to say the least, but it did well at the box office and was able to just edge out the third week of Oppenheimer, which percentage-wise actually held better than Barbie. Just a 37.6% drop from last weekend, a $29.1 million weekend, and a domestic total of over $228.9 million. In fourth place was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem, which made $28 million from Friday through Sunday. It almost certainly would have taken second place if it had not opened on Wednesday, but it decided to get a jump on the box office by opening a couple days early. It so far has made $43 million in 5 days of release, and we'll look at the Turtles franchise as a whole very shortly. In fifth place, any hopes that Haunted Mansion might be saved by audience enthusiasm is quickly waning because it dropped 61.7%. That's a comic book movie drop for a family film. That's not what you want to see. $9.2 million in weekend number 2 and a $42.2 million total through 2 weekends in release. And very quickly, when we look at that top 5, you see that there are 4 films that are over $25 million for the weekend. That's something that hasn't happened in almost 5 years. And I know we usually have a box office flashback later in the show. We'll still have that, but I wanted to take a look at the last weekend where we had 4 movies with $25+ million grosses in the top 5. It was Thanksgiving weekend of 2018 when Ralph Breaks the Internet opened to $56.2 million in its first 3-day weekend. Creed 2 also opening to $35.5 million in its first 3-day weekend. Then we had the continued runs of The Grinch in week 3 and the second week of Fantastic Beasts: The Crimes of Grindelwald. Bohemian Rhapsody was pulling a very strong number 5 there with just a 12.7% drop from the week before. And it just goes to show you that this run that we've been on since Barbie and Oppenheimer opened, it's not just one of those, oh, it's good considering since theaters opened, we're almost back up to average of where we were. No, for any time in recent box office history, this is one of the better runs that we've been on in the last several years, and we have Barbie and Oppenheimer to thank for it, and especially, of course, Barbie. Looking at number 6 through 10 for the past weekend, Sound of Freedom is in 6th place with a 40.9% drop in week 5 and a $7.5 million total. Its domestic total is now at over $164 million, and I have a great excerpt from an interview I did with the vice president of Angel Studios that we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1 continues to sink down the box office charts. There is no hope for some kind of a surge or a resurgence or a revival. It is going to be a box office disappointment, to say the least. A 37.8% drop in week 4, a $6.6 million total, and a domestic total of $151.1 million. Talk to Me held really well for a horror film, and especially for an A24 horror film, which can be pretty polarizing. It dropped just 39.9% in weekend 2 for a $6.2 million total and a domestic total of just over $22.1 million. That's great considering the budget of that film. Rocky Aur Rani Ki Prem Kahani, I'm doing the best I can here, also with a great hold. It dropped just 2.6% from its opening weekend for a $1.529 million total and a $3.2 million domestic total so far. And likely spending its last weekend in the top 10 is Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. It dropped 59.9% in week 5 for a $1.5 million total and a domestic total of just over $170.7 million. 2 movies that did drop out of the top 10 were Elemental, which spent 7 weeks in the top 10, and Insidious: The Red Door, which spent 4 weeks in the top 10. Both impressive runs given the fact that Insidious: The Red Door is a horror film in the summer. It stuck around for a good length of time, and really impressive for Elemental considering that it opened with less money than The Flash and yet hung around in the box office top 10 for over a month longer. That just goes to show you the longevity that that film had at the domestic box office, especially considering The Flash, which is, in any other summer it would be the flop of the summer, but I actually have to crunch some numbers to see what actually is because there's a lot of competition. And the big reason why both of those movies probably did drop out of the top 10 is because they were amongst the movies that lost the most theaters over last weekend. Insidious: The Red Door led the way. It dropped 1,090 theaters to play in 824 theaters, so it technically fell out of wide release. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny dropped 975 theaters. It's still playing in 1,190 theaters. Elemental dropped out of 945 theaters. It's still playing in 1,160 theaters. Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1, again on this list, it dropped another 769 theaters. It has 2,422 theaters remaining. And then the first slam dunk, that's the problem with a smaller, non-wide release, it dropped 513 theaters. It's remaining only in 68 theaters. So if you were in a market that had the first slam dunk and you didn't see it last weekend, it looks like you only had a 1-week window because it is only in a handful of theaters now nationwide. And this chart is probably a good example of why this is my local market and the distribution between these different movies. These were all movies playing on Sunday, August 6th, and the showtimes that were available, this spans 5 theaters, 60 screens, and 234 total showtimes. Barbie remains remains the market leader. It had 22% of all showtimes in my market on Sunday. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem was in second place. It had 17% of all shows, followed by Meg 2, which did not have a big market share when you compare it to those two movies. Only 11% of all showtimes in my market were Meg 2, which makes its number 2 debut even more impressive. Oppenheimer actually tied there with an 11% market share and 26 shows, followed by Haunted Mansion, which has dropped down to 10% market share here. Talk to Me still has 9%, Sound of Freedom at 7%, Mission Impossible at just 5%. It only showed 11 times in 5 theaters in my local market on Sunday, and then all other movies at 8% with 18 total showtimes. And when we look at this weekend's box office total versus the average from pre-pandemic 2015 to 2019 and then 2021 to 2022 as theaters reopened, you can see that we are still above average from the pre-pandemic times. Without a huge wide release this weekend, it's likely that we may meet or perhaps dip below that blue line again, which would be the average pre-pandemic, but you never know. We'll have to see how this weekend pans out. The highest performing film for the 5 years preceding the theater closures in 2020 was Hobbs and Shaw, starring Jason Statham, so it's a big week for Jason Statham this first week in August. The highest performing film for the years 2021 to 2022, another film starring Dwayne Johnson, Disney's Jungle Cruise, which had a hybrid theatrical and streaming release. But you can see that the weekend average for this first week in August for the last couple years has been under $100 million. We've almost doubled that here this past weekend. So the box office continuing to show strength, and I think it's very actually encouraging, even though I didn't like Meg 2 The Trench, the fact that Barbie and Oppenheimer continue to do well. The fact that Meg 2 had a pretty good debut domestically, considering how other sequels have done. The fact that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem, especially given its reported $70 million budget, was able to have a strong performance in its opening week, is encouraging to me in the sense that it seems like people are going back to the movies. They're seeking out different movies. It's not feast or famine like we've been seeing a lot since movies reopened, where we have one movie taking all of the money and everyone else just kind of fighting for scraps. It seems like perhaps people are getting back in the habit of going back to the theaters, which I think makes it even more critical that a decision or a deal get worked out with the actor strike and the writer strike, because if movies start getting delayed again and you get people out of that habit after 2 years of trying to get people back into the habit, who knows what's going to happen then? So very critical time for Hollywood, and I hope that people really start taking it seriously, because I don't think that all parties are taking this seriously right now, and they need to be. Looking at the summer box office chart for this year, it's official. Barbie now the highest grossing movie of the summer, and I can't imagine anyone displacing it. $459.3 million puts it above Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, which drops to number 2. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 drops to number 3. The Little Mermaid is still trying to swim to $300 million. You know, Disney's somehow able to make these things happen, so I bet eventually it does cross that $300 million mark. Oppenheimer, though, is right behind it, also aiming for $3 million. It's at $228.9 million at number 5. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is at number 6, although Sound of Freedom is rising quickly. It's right now at number 7. It bumps Transformers Rise of the Beasts down to number 8. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 is back on the box office chart after slipping off of the chart last week. Elemental stays at number 10, and then Fast X is now out of the competition as a top 10 summer movie. And when you look at my predictions, that is my second casualty as far as movies that I predicted to be in the summer top 10. I picked The Flash number 4. It's gone. I picked Fast X number 8, so not quite as embarrassing a pick for me. It is now gone, and honestly, it may have stayed there had Sound of Freedom not come in and surprised everyone. The only big silver lining for me is that with Barbie ascending to the number 1 spot, that means that I, for right now, correctly picked the second and third highest grossing films of the summer in Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. And as of right now, I picked Indiana Jones in the correct spot at number 6, though it may soon slip to number 7 or even further. So if nothing else really breaks through, if Blue Beetle, for example, doesn't do well, although it sounds like it might be positioning itself to have a not embarrassing box office run, then we could be looking at the final 10 movies of summer 2023. But if this summer has taught us anything, it is that we should be expecting the unexpected. So I'm not going to say that this is the 10, because you never quite know what is going to happen, even though we only have a few weeks of summer left. Let's take a look outside of the domestic marketplace, and Meg 2: The Trench was the #1 performer internationally. It made $112 million in all other markets besides the United States and Canada. Barbie in second place now with $74 million, followed by Oppenheimer with another $52.8 million. It's a really strong performer worldwide. The Chinese film Creation of the Gods 1: Kingdom of Storms hangs around at $38 million in fourth place. And in fifth place, the Chinese film One and Only, which is set for a limited release this weekend in the domestic market, is at $19.1 million. When you combine the domestic gross and the international grosses for the weekend, we get our top 5 films worldwide, and the #1 film was The Trench, which debuts to $142 million, so not a bad start for that film. Barbie dropped just 41% worldwide. Its drops domestically and worldwide have been almost in lockstep. It's pretty crazy. Another $127 million for Barbie over this past weekend. Oppenheimer drops just 31.2% for an $81.9 million weekend. Reportedly, the fact that it is screening so heavily and is so heavily attended in the premium formats, especially IMAX, that's a big reason why the grosses are high on Oppenheimer, because those tickets bring in more money because they cost more. That's how economics work. The Chinese film Creation of the Gods 1: Kingdom of Storms also has a good hold at 33.8% for a $38 million total worldwide. And then Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem opening at $36.5 million worldwide. It's open in a few markets besides the domestic market, but it really begins to roll out worldwide throughout the rest of this month and then going into September. So we'll see how it continues to do on this worldwide chart as it hits all of these other markets. So let's talk about Barbie, because it is starting to hit some marks, not just as far as the weekend goes, but as far as other parts and the record book go. And let's look first at where it stands as far as the highest grossing films of the decade of the 2020s worldwide. It's now the 5th highest grossing film of the 2020s at $1,032 million. It's behind the Super Mario Brothers movie at $1.355 billion, Top Gun Maverick at $1.478 billion, Spider-Man No Way Home at $1.91 billion, and then of course Avatar: The Way of Water at $2.319 billion. I think it's got a good shot at overtaking the Super Mario Brothers movie. It shows no sign of slowing down right now. If it can keep going, I think it could overcome Top Gun Maverick, although that might be a bit of a steeper thing to ask. I don't think it's going to get up to Spider-Man No Way Home, but that does not derail the fact that this movie is an absolute box office phenomenon around the world, not just domestically. When we look at the highest grossing films of the decade domestically, there's Barbie at number 5. It is currently about $115 million behind the Super Mario Brothers movie, which is currently the highest grossing movie of 2023 domestically. Avatar: The Way of Water is the 3rd highest grossing movie of the decade domestically at $684 million, followed by Top Gun Maverick at $718.7 million, and Spider-Man No Way Home at $814.1 million. And to see where Barbie might land on this chart, this is Barbie's performance so far against other top grossers of the 2020s domestically. Now, Spider-Man No Way Home is not on this chart because it would have just thrown the whole scale off. Barbie is not matching anything that No Way Home did, but you can see it is pacing ahead as far as day-by-day box office goes of all of the other top grossers for the 2020s. Black Panther: Wakanda Forever is on there as well, because it would be the next down the list if you take Spider-Man No Way Home off. Now, will it have the longevity of Avatar: The Way of Water? I don't know. We'll have to see. That's how Avatar really set those big grosses. It wasn't because it popped out of the gate necessarily. It's because it just kept making money week after week. But Barbie also has a lot of runway ahead. There's really not a huge release that's going to compete directly with it for quite some time. It's got pretty much the rest of August going into September to do what it does. So we will continue tracking, or I will continue tracking here on the show, how it does against these other films. And when we look at the race for the #1 grossing movie of the year domestically, it's between Barbie and the Super Mario Brothers movie, but it's a bit of a tough comparison because remember that the Super Mario Brothers movie opened on a Wednesday, Barbie opened on a Friday. So when we look at this chart through 17 days, you see that the gap widens between Barbie and Super Mario Brothers, but that's because the next 2 days of Super Mario Brothers release are 2 weekend days, Saturday and Sunday, whereas it's a Monday and Tuesday for Barbie. So I will continue to track this. Right now, Barbie is almost $60 million ahead of where Super Mario Brothers was on its pace. So if it keeps at this pace, then it would easily become the #1 movie of the year, and I expect it to do that. But I will keep tracking this just because it is kind of interesting to see Mario close the gaps on the off days, because it's kind of playing on the downbeats where Barbie is kind of hitting the upbeats. Although Barbie's also putting up great weekday grosses as well. Some other records are getting ready to fall, including the highest grossing film domestically directed or co-directed by a woman. Right now, Barbie is second place on that list. It has jumped Captain Marvel, Wonder Woman, and the first Frozen film to be the second highest grossing film directed by a woman domestically. And it's really a day or two away from passing Frozen 2 domestically to become the highest grossing film directed by a woman of all time domestically. So that's one feather to put in Greta Gerwig's cap. She's also climbing the charts for highest grossing films directed or co-directed by a woman worldwide. Barbie's just the fourth film from a female director to break that $1 billion barrier, and the only one that was directed solely by a female director. China's Hi Mom, directed by Jia Ling, is at number 5 at $841.6 million all time, followed by Barbie at just over $1 billion, Captain Marvel at $1.129 billion. That movie was co-directed by Anna Boden, and then two films that were co-directed by Jennifer Lee, the first Frozen film at $1.284 billion, and then Frozen 2 at $1.453 billion. So we will continue to track Barbie. I think it's got another $150-200 million left in the tank domestically, which gets it about halfway to Frozen 2. Will it become the highest grossing film directed by a woman of all time worldwide? We will continue to track that here in the show, and I will update you as the figures come in. Speaking of figures, let's look at my revised theatrical profit estimate for Barbie. And Warner Brothers is really, really appreciating that they put this movie out, because right now it's brought in, I estimate, $6.8 million back to investors from China, $217.2 million back from the international box office. That's a 40% share of what the movie's made there thus far. Then $155 million from the first week of domestic release, $81.3 million from week 2, and then $26.5 million from this last weekend. Against the movie's budget of $145 million and reported advertising budget of $150 million, that puts production costs at $295 million. The gross is now just over $1 billion. I estimate that $487 million of that has been netted back to investors, which means that currently, by my estimates, Barbie has turned a profit in the theatrical window of $192 million based solely on global box office receipts, keeping in mind this does not count any kind of merchandising deal that the movie has, any kind of physical media sales. None of that counts, not to mention what I'm sure will be considerable profits that Mattel is going to bring in from more Barbie merchandise sold. This movie is printing money. We see profitable films now and again on the show. We don't see too many that absolutely print money. Barbie is a money printer. But another movie that's also doing really well, if not printing money at the same rate, is Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. It has now taken its place amongst Nolan's 5 highest grossing films of all time, unadjusted for inflation. It has passed the domestic gross of Batman Begins. It's now looking to take down Inception, where it will probably settle in as the 3rd highest grossing film of Nolan's career domestically. So that's great news for Christopher Nolan. But one thing that I wanted to look into, and one of the reasons that I like to do this show, is that sometimes a movie like Oppenheimer will pop up, and it's usually a movie that is not in the shadow of necessarily, but playing alongside a phenomenal box office hit like Barbie. Movies like Oppenheimer will put up great domestic grosses, but never actually be number 1 at the domestic box office. And Oppenheimer is now in the top 5 as far as domestic grosses for films that were never number 1. So let's look at this list first unadjusted, and then we'll look at the adjusted list because it's even more interesting. But what a movie marathon this would be. So currently right now, unadjusted for inflation, Sing is the highest grossing film to never hit number 1 at the domestic box office at $270.3 million. Sing opened at Christmas back in 2016 behind week 2 of Rogue One, A Star Wars Story. It came within a couple of $1 million in its 3rd week of release, but lost out to Hidden Figures, so it never hit number 1. Then you have My Big Fat Greek Wedding, which was just a pure word of mouth hit. It opened in April. It didn't hit the top 5 until August. It almost took the top spot against the movie Swim Fan, but did not. It stayed in the top 10 until Thanksgiving, and this is a box office run that objectively would not happen today. There is no way that an indie comedy, even if it was performing well, would be released in April and then have a distributor that would keep it in theaters for 4 months until August. It would have been on streaming by the time My Big Fat Greek Wedding hit the top 5, and it just goes to show you that this whole direct to streaming or straight to streaming, sometimes you could be missing out on a phenomenal theatrical run. Who knows how many movies could have caught fire with word of mouth and had an incredible box office run, but we never found out because it got yanked and put onto a streaming service. It's just a sign of the time. time. So I don't think we'll see the likes of My Big Fat Greek Wedding again. Then you have Oppenheimer. It's currently number 3 on this list, but I think it is all but assured to be officially, when you don't adjust for inflation, the highest grossing film ever at the domestic box office to never hit number 1. And then look at these two movies, very similar movies, at number 4 and 5. Alvin and the Chipmunks, The Squeakquel, and then the first Alvin and the Chipmunks film. That's right, 2 separate Alvin and the Chipmunks films both made this list. The Squeakquel opened back in 2009 at Christmas behind week 2 of Avatar and also Sherlock Holmes. It competed for number 2 a couple times, but Avatar was just dominant. And then Alvin and the Chipmunks opened 10 days before Christmas at number 2 behind the movie I Am Legend. It was competitive with National Treasure Book of Secrets in its 3rd week of release, but never made number 1, hung around the box office charts through January. So that's the list when you don't adjust for inflation, but it gets even more interesting when you do. I will say, by the way, Box Office Mojo has a list of movies that are the top grossing ones to never hit number 1. It's garbage, and it's like absolutely wrong. There's a few movies in there that verifiably through research you can find did hit number 1. I don't know why it's not been corrected, but if you've looked at Box Office Mojo's site lately, other than the real-time data, I guess it's not really that surprising. The plundering and cannibalization of Box Office Mojo by Amazon is still one of my greatest... Oh, it makes me so angry just as an analyst and a box office guy. Just why did they do that? Okay, let's look at the highest grossing films to never hit number 1 at the box office when you do adjust for inflation. And number 1, you might be surprised to hear, is Gremlins. Gremlins opened the same week as Ghostbusters in June of 1984. It ran a strong second place for several weeks, but Ghostbusters was just so dominant that Gremlins could never break through to that number 1 spot. But it made an adjusted total of $445.3 million, never number 1. Then you have Kevin Costner's Dances with Wolves, the Best Picture winner. It made $430 million adjusted for inflation. Dances with Wolves went into wide release in November of 1990 against week 2 of another box office juggernaut, Home Alone. It hung around in the top 5 until March through Oscar season, but never got higher than number 2, again thanks to the prolonged box office dominance of Home Alone. My Big Fat Greek Wedding also has an adjusted total at $409.4 million. It's at number 3. Sing is at number 2 at $343.7 million. And then in 5th place is the Disney Rick Moranis film Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. It has an adjusted box office total of $321.6 million. That movie debuted the same weekend as Batman back in 1989, stayed in the top 5 for 5 weeks in a competitive summer, never hit number 1, but is number 5 on this list. Don't you just love these little sidetracks that we take? But let's get out of the past and get back into the present and look at the profitability estimates that I have for Oppenheimer. And this chart does include, and we've talked about it the last couple of weeks, the 20% first dollar gross cut that Christopher Nolan gets from the profits. And a lot of people have said, well, wait a minute. It seems kind of weird that you're including it just for this movie because lots of different movies have profit participants like Christopher Nolan. And you're right, they do. The only reason that I'm including Nolan's in this particular chart is because it is well publicized exactly what this deal is. We know that he is getting a 20% first dollar gross deal. I'm sure that Greta Gerwig and Margot Robbie probably have participation deals on Barbie. I just don't know what they are. If I knew exactly what they were, then I would put those in those calculations. But yes, the reason that we do Nolan on this chart and not any of the others is because it is a known quantity. And that's what I try to deal with here is known quantities. So looking at Oppenheimer's performance, it has not yet opened in China, so nothing from that market as of yet. I estimate that $130.8 million has come back to investors from the international run of the movie, $76.7 million from its opening weekend, $39.5 million from its second weekend release, and another $14.5 million from this past weekend. Its reported budget was $100 million, with another $100 million put up for promotion and advertising. Its current worldwide gross is at $556.1 million. I estimate that $261.7 million of that has come back to the studio against costs of $200 million. And even if you take out $52.3 million for Nolan, which is 20% of the net money that's coming back to the studio and investors, I still estimate that Oppenheimer has become profitable in the theatrical window to the tune of $9.4 million. So any other money that comes in will be profit, in addition, of course, to all of the other ancillary markets. So it is not a money printer like Barbie, but again, the goal of every studio is for your movie to become profitable in the theatrical window. Barbie has certainly done it. I estimate that Oppenheimer has also done it. And so this is a real success story for both of these two films. We've got so much more to get to, but before we do, I want to take a moment to thank this week's sponsors. This episode's brought to you by Mint Mobile, and if you're like me, you've got enough frustrations in your life without having to worry about dealing with a big cell phone provider. The endless waiting times if you try to call somebody, trying to find someone who actually knows what's in your plan, it's absolutely maddening. Well, the answer to that problem is here, and it's called Mint Mobile. Mint Mobile offers premium wireless starting at just $15 a month, no binding contracts or ridiculous promotions, and no charges that you're not going to be able to find out about until you get your bill. My mom just switched to Mint Mobile, and the great customer service staff was there to help walk her through the process every step of the way and make sure that she was good to go. And for a retiree on a fixed income, the savings every month mean a lot. Mint Mobile gives you the best rate whether you're buying for one or a family, and at Mint, families start at 2 lines. All plans come with unlimited talk and text plus high-speed data delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. You can use your own phone with any Mint Mobile plan, and you can keep your same phone number along with all of your existing contacts. Get premium wireless from just $15 a month and no unexpected surprises at mintmobile.com/Murrell. That's mintmobile.com/Murrell. Seriously, you'll make your wallet very happy at mintmobile.com/Murrell. This episode's brought to you by ExpressVPN. Huge tech companies in America may pay next to nothing in taxes, but they certainly do take a lot, at least when it comes to your data. They take your web history, email metadata, and even your video searches to create a profile on you, and then they sell that profile off to the highest bidder. They're not just selling you a product, they're selling you and everything you do online. To protect your identity and data from these tech giants, I recommend using, and I use, ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN makes you anonymous online by camouflaging your IP address and replacing it with a different secure IP address of your choice, which means that these big companies can't track you or your location to collect and sell data. ExpressVPN also encrypts everything you do so that it's protected from hackers and anybody else that might be trying to spy on you. And what I like the most about ExpressVPN is how easy it is to use. You just download the app on your phone or computer, hit one button, and you are protected. So if you're like me and you believe that your internet data belongs to you and not to corporations, then ExpressVPN is the answer. Protect your data with the #1 rated VPN provider today. Visit expressvpn.com/Murrell to get 3 months free on a 1-year package. That's expressvpn.com/Murrell. expressvpn.com/Murrell to learn more. Let's look now at the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles franchise. The latest film, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem, competed with Oppenheimer and Meg 2 The Trench for that #2 spot. And let's see where it stands as far as the previous film's opening weekend. If you do not adjust for inflation, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem put up the 3rd best opening weekend in the history of the franchise. Again, if it had opened on Friday, I think it would have easily laid claim to that 2nd spot, which is currently held by Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Out of the Shadows. 2014's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles currently has the highest opening in the history of the franchise at $65.5 million. 1990's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is number 4 with $25.3 million. 2007's TMNT is in 5th place. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, The Secret of the Ooze is in 6th place. And 1993's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, A Basement Dweller, and this is going to be a trend when we look at these charts, in 7th place. When we look at opening weekends adjusted for inflation, 2014's Ninja Turtles still holds that #1 spot with $84.5 million adjusted. It did drive crowds out for that opening weekend. 1990's Ninja Turtles, though, moves up to #2 with $59.2 million. 2016's TMNT Out of the Shadows moves to #3 with $44.8 million, just edging out The Secret of the Ooze from 1991, which is at $44.871 million. 2007's TMNT is in 5th place with $35.6 million, followed by Mutant Mayhem in 6th place at $28 million, which is just enough to keep it out of the basement, with 1993's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 bringing in $26.2 million. Just to kind of set a baseline here, when we look at final domestic gross, Mutant Mayhem has already passed the final domestic gross of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, and I think it's pretty much locked that it's going to get up to at least #3 and bypass the gross of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Out of the Shadows back in 2016. The question now becomes legs. Will it be able to leg out to about $150 million or so? Then it could become the 2nd highest grossing film in the Turtles franchise domestically, unseating 1990's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Of course, when you adjust for inflation, that bumps Mutant Mayhem down to number 7. And it looks like if it has one of those runs, again, getting up to around $150 million, then it could become the 4th highest grossing film domestically for the franchise. 1990's Ninja Turtles is easily the number 1 film if you adjust for inflation. It brought in $315.7 million back in 1990, one of the most successful independent films of all time. 2014's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is in 2nd place at $246.4 million. And then Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, The Secret of the Ooze, brought in $176.2 million. But look at the drop-off there between 1990's Ninja Turtles and 1991's sequel, and also the drop-off between 2014's Ninja Turtles and its sequel in 2016. That's going to be the challenge, I think, for Seth Rogen and the producers of Mutant Mayhem, is the history of the Ninja Turtles franchise, because it is one of rapidly diminishing returns. Now, this is kind of a fresher take. The plan is to integrate it into a TV show and then launch another movie after that. And if it can kind of build on the sort of thing we've seen with Into the Spider-Verse and Across the Spider-Verse, where it builds buzz because it has been a well-received movie over the next few years, then we could see it increase as far as the opening weekend. It would be the first Ninja Turtles sequel to do so. Every other Ninja Turtles sequel has opened below the previous Turtles films. So in building this new Turtles franchise, the producers are really looking to defy history and do something that has not previously been done when it comes to the Ninja Turtles. Finally, looking at worldwide gross, Mutant Mayhem currently at $51.5 million. As I mentioned, the vast majority of its global markets are still ahead of it. It looks like it will easily pass The Secret of the Ooze and 2007's TMNT. And if it can get up to around $200 million, it will also challenge 1990's original film. Then we'll see how it does compared to the 2 Michael Bay produced films from the mid-2010s. Let's talk briefly about the 6th place film, which is Sound of Freedom. We've talked about it on this show a lot. It has generated a lot of controversy. But one thing that I really wanted to dig back into, and it's been bothering me for a month, really since it opened back on July 4th, was just how this pay it forward system worked as far as box office reporting. Because you'll remember, way back when I covered the opening day of July 4th, there was a claim that it was the highest grossing performing film that day of July 4th, that it had beaten Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, and they cited the pay it forward tickets. And my big question was that money actually spent at the box office, or was this money pledged to the pay it forward system, but money that had not yet been spent? And if it was the latter, then I didn't think it was really fair to claim number 1. Luckily, I was able to reach out to Angel Studios. They got back to me, and I got right to the top, honestly. I got a chance to talk to Brandon Purdy, who is vice president and head of distribution at Angel Studios. He handles the theatrical market, so he's the one that would have answers to this question. We talked for about 20 minutes. I've excerpted this small portion where we talk specifically about the pay it forward system and the opening weekend box office of Sound of Freedom. However, it is a much longer interview, and you can check the link in the description down below, as well as a little card I'll put up in the corner so you can click to watch the whole thing. It'll probably go out on the channel later this week, so you'll get a sneak peek as a Charts with Dan viewer. But let's go very quickly to this interview with Brandon Purdy as I break down the opening weekend of Sound of Freedom and just how pay it forward works. So first of all, the pay it forward system, this is not something we were talking a little bit before we started. This is not something that people are used to when it comes to box office, because it's pretty much worked the same way forever. Somebody buys a ticket either online or at the ticket counter, and that gets reported as the box office gross. What is the difference between that system and then the pay it forward system for people that just don't even really quite know how this works?
Yeah, so from a consumer standpoint of buying a ticket, it's actually exactly the same, but they're using a code instead of currency.
So to clear up, I think one misperception of the system that people have, when somebody buys a ticket for somebody else, when they go on the site or they pay it forward, that is not reported as box office gross until someone redeems that ticket. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So people pay it forward in theaters. And that's a person saying, I want to buy tickets. I want to buy 20 tickets. I want to buy 25. I want to buy 5. I want to buy 100 tickets. And I want those tickets to be available for people to use to see the movie. At that point, they're not reported as box office. It just goes into a bucket. Somebody comes and gets the code and they go buy the ticket. Once they transact that ticket online and they have a ticket in hand or in their inbox, then that goes towards box office like any other way a person would purchase a ticket with cash or with a card or any other way. At that point, once somebody gets a ticket, redeems it, and goes and watches the movie, that's when that is reported as box office. And we use all the same systems and programs and that everybody else uses to get their grosses to be able to report them. So it comes through just like a normal ticket purchase. The theaters just have no idea that it's any different than just a normal purchase.
So I actually had a question, because I remember going way back to the beginning of it. The week before Sound of Freedom opened, I flagged it as something. I just said like, hey, there's some buzz kind of coming up in some stories. They're saying that this movie could really surprise people. But that initial reporting when it opened on July 4th, it seemed like that might have been, and correct me if I'm wrong, the only time that there was ever some reporting done of the pay it forward system before any of that was redeemed. Were some of the initial numbers, like that first day, was there any of that pay it forward money that was reported as box office, or was that all pure tickets sold box office initially?
That was box office. What was reported, the 14 number, we were simply just being able to say to all the people who had pre-purchased, like, we were just trying to give a shout out to the people who had paid it forward and the people who redeemed and whatnot. But
because that was a little bit confusing to me, and I know even some of the industry, like Deadline, for example, took issue with it, because I think they interpreted it as that the reporting was being done for tickets that had been, bought for others but had not yet been redeemed. But that wasn't the case. It was just that you were saying, hey, of this 14 million that's brought in, X amount of it was from people that bought tickets for other people.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely was could have been more clear on our part, but yeah, it did confuse some people. But yeah,
okay, that's great to know, though, because that's one of the reasons I want to do this interview, is because and I said it on the show, my show is a numbers show, and the thing for me is always like, let's dig down into it, let's get the answers, let's get the numbers, because there's always opinions about movies and reviews, but my thing is like, there's always the numbers, and the numbers are what they are. So that's a great clarification to have. That's just part of the interview, and we covered a lot of ground, including the stories that you've seen online about empty theaters. Brandon was really open to talk about anything when it comes to the release of the film. It was a really interesting discussion. Again, check the link in the description below. There's a little card up in the corner. You can click there to see my full conversation, or you can probably stay tuned here to the channel, because I'll probably publish the full interview later on this week. Just mopping up the top 10 here, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 is a disappointment, not only domestically, but also worldwide, especially when you consider how much was spent on it. It has now passed the worldwide totals of Mission Impossible 3 and the original Mission Impossible, but it is still well short of not only Mission Impossible 2, but really its brethren in the franchise, the later films. It's not going to approach the grosses of those films. The bottom has dropped out really of the movie, both domestically and worldwide. So we'll see if it'll get past that $500 million mark. I think that it will, but how much more than that, I'm not really sure. Also for Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, again, kind of an empty victory here as it starts to finish up its run. It has been able to pass the worldwide gross of Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's now the third highest grossing Indiana Jones film of all time, but these are not inflation adjusted numbers. So the fact that it just barely inched past a movie that came out 40 years ago, that's not so good. So yeah, another big box office disappointment in Dial of Destiny. And all of the victories that we've been talking about the last several weeks, your Barbies and Oppenheimers, it has been easy to forget about all of the failures that marked the first 2/3 of the summer, and yet here they are, staring us in the face still. Looking at the past weekend, let's take a look at some other charts. These are the per theater averages for August 4th through the 6th. At number 1 was Passages, which is a critically acclaimed film. It stars Franz Rogowski and Ben Whishaw as a married couple who find themselves in the middle of an unexpected love triangle. It played in just 3 theaters, but brought in $21,092 per theater. In second place was Barbie, which brought in $12,688 per theater in 4,178 theaters. So easily the widest release, but still number 2. Theater per theater. Meg 2, The Trench is in third place with $8,565 in just over 3,500 theaters, followed by Oppenheimer at just over $8,000 in 3,600 theaters, and then Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem playing in an almost identical number of theaters as Meg 2, bringing in 7,973. So a robust weekend at the box office, theater by theater, this past weekend. Looking at films in limited release, that would be 1,000 theaters or fewer. Rocky Aur Rani Ki Prem Kahani remains number 1 at $1.5 million in 270 theaters. Theater Camp continues its expansion. It really hasn't caught fire. Again, I think it's being held back by limited availability and just the oxygen out of the room being taken up by Barbie. $602,000 as it continues a slow release. We'll see if it continues to add theaters. Randall Park's Shortcomings, his theatrical debut as a director, was playing in over 400 theaters and brought in $300,000. Great to see a movie from Randall in theaters. Dreamin' Wild played in 402 theaters and brought in $136,391 total. And then Cat Video Fest 2023, playing in just 36 theaters, was able to make the top 5 at $122,000. People can't get enough of those cat videos, although you can watch so many for free on the internet. I guess there's something about seeing it with a crowd. I don't know. When we look at the annual domestic box office chart, the Super Mario Bros. Movie is number 1 for now, but Barbie is closing fast. It's now about $115 million behind Super Mario Brothers. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse bumped down to number 3. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 bumped down to number 4. The Little Mermaid remains number 5 for right now. Oppenheimer jumps up 2 spots to number 6. It has now outgrossed Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. If you had the R-rated 3-hour historical drama outgrossing the Marvel big phase kickoff, then congratulations to you. Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, now the 7th highest grossing film of the year at $214.5 million. John Wick Chapter 4 drops down to number 8. Indiana Jones stays at number 9. And Sound of Freedom enters the 2023 domestic box office chart at $164 million, bumping out Transformers: Rise of the Beasts. Looking at the top films worldwide for 2023, you see that Barbie now the second $1 billion plus grosser of the year behind the Super Mario Bros. Movie. Guardians of the Galaxy drops down 1 spot to number 3. Fast X and Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse stay at number 4 and 5. And then at number 9, Oppenheimer jumps onto the list at $556.1 million and looks to be passing The Little Mermaid's worldwide gross very soon. So this is another movie surprising not just domestically, but also worldwide. China's Lost in the Stars drops down to number 10. Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania drops off of the top 10 grossing films of 2023 worldwide altogether. Before we take a look at some of the movies that are opening this weekend, as always, I like to take a look back at a weekend in box office history. And we're going back to a weekend that's not only interesting to look at, but has a lot of weird parallels with this past weekend at the box office. This is July 30th through August 1st, 1999, the 31st weekend of the year, which saw the opening of Julia Roberts and Richard Gere in Runaway Bride to $35 million. Its final domestic total would eventually be $152.2 million. The Blair Witch Project was in its 3rd week of release, but this was the weekend that it went wide. You see that 1,376.5% increase in business. That's from hitting the nation after 2 big buzzy weeks in limited release. $29.2 million. In many ways, it was the Sound of Freedom of its summer in that it was the movie that nobody really saw coming. For a $36.1 million total, its final gross was $140.5 million. I think it actually broke Ninja Turtles' record as the most successful independent film of all time. Deep Blue Sea opened in 3rd place at $19.1 million. It tried to get a jump on the weekend box office by opening on Wednesday, so its total through the weekend was $25.1 million. Its final domestic total stood at $73.6 million. The Haunting was in 4th place in its 2nd week of release, a 54.4% drop at $15.2 million total. Its domestic total to that point was $63.9 million, and its final domestic total was $91.4 million. Then in 5th place was Inspector Gadget. Its 2nd week saw a 35.4% drop and a $14.1 million weekend total. Its total up to that point was $47.8 million, and its final domestic total was $97.4 million. So I mentioned when I was setting this up that this weekend had a lot of weird parallels to this past weekend here in 2023 in box office history, and not all of them are evident, but let's look at these movies. First, you have the number 1 movie, Runaway Bride, a female skewing film co-starring a romantic lead with the initials of RG, Richard Gere, Ryan Gosling, so parallels to Barbie there. Then you had the Blair Witch Project, a viral sensation that shocked everyone with its opening weekend and posed unexpected competition to the other movies in the top 5, much like Barbenheimer and Sound of Freedom this summer. Deep Blue Sea, a shark movie, much like Meg 2, that opened on a Wednesday to avoid competition, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem. Then we have The Haunting, which is a haunted house movie starring Owen Wilson, much like Haunted Mansion, which is a haunted house movie starring Owen Wilson. And then finally, Inspector Gadget, a 5th place Disney film like Haunted Mansion, and a movie based on a kid's property aiming to win over new fans and nostalgic older fans like we currently have with Barbie. Am I probably reaching on some of these? Yes, but it is interesting to see these weird parallels between weeks that are decades apart from each other. Of course, we also like to put these weekends in context by adjusting for inflation, and when we hit that inflation button, we see that Runaway Bride opened to an adjusted total of $64.2 million and had a final adjusted total of $278.8 million domestic. The Blair Witch Project's adjusted total was $53.4 million. That is insane. Its final domestic total was around $257.3 million. Deep Blue Sea opened to an adjusted $34.9 million. Its adjusted total was $134.8 million domestic. The Haunting with a $27.9 million adjusted weekend total. Its final total adjusted was $167.4 million. And then Inspector Gadget with $25.8 million and a final domestic total of $178.3 million. And it did one up this past weekend because you see there, adjusted for inflation, this weekend had 5 movies in the top 5 that were all over $25 million grossers. I'm sure there are a lot of theater owners that would like to see a return to these kinds of figures. We got close this last weekend, but not quite. Let's take a look at some of the movies that are in theaters now and will be in theaters this upcoming weekend, and it's something I've been doing called Rotten Tomatoes Decoded. The fresh Rotten meter is binary. It tells you whether critics liked a movie, but it doesn't tell you how much critics liked a movie, and that can sometimes be a little misleading when you're trying to figure out just what the critical hits are right now. So first we're going to look at some current and new releases. When you look just at the tomato meter, that fresh Rotten metric, and you see that right now the lowest rated thing in theaters is Meg 2: The Trench with just a 28% fresh. That means that of all critics, only 28% gave it a positive review. Haunted Mansion and The Pod Generation, which is an indie film coming out of Sundance, are both at 40% right now on Rotten Tomatoes. Barbie's at 88%. Oppenheimer, which if you'll notice right now is the 5th highest tomato meter on this chart, is at 93%, tied with Passages. Then we have Talk to Me at 94%, Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning at 96%, alongside Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Mutant Mayhem, also at 96%. So if you're going just by the tomato meter, then the freshest movies that are playing right now would be a tie between Mission Impossible and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But when you look at the average rating, which is a 1 through 10 score that critics assign these movies, that tell you how much critics like a movie, not just whether they like a movie, it tells a different story. First of all, Meg 2: The Trench has an average rating of 4.5, which is considerably better than just the 28% Rotten that it currently has. That probably means that critics were a little bit more mixed on the movie, but trended negative instead of being absolutely negative on everything. But let's look at the top of this chart. Remember that Oppenheimer was the 5th highest when you look at tomato meter rating, but again, as it has been the last several weeks, it has the highest critics average rating of all the movies that we're looking at. It has an average rating of 8.6, which is easily higher than the next movie down, which is Mission Impossible, with an average rating of 8 out of 10. So what that means is that Oppenheimer was a little bit more divisive amongst critics, which means it got a few more rotten reviews, but the critics that saw it liked it the most on a 1 to 10 scale out of any other movie that we're talking about. And that to me is a much more reliable metric of what critics think. Mission Impossible there in second, Barbie at a 7.9 and third. And look at Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Mutant Mayhem. By tomato meter rating, it was at number 1 on the list, but here it is the 6th highest. It has a 7.6 average rating, but a 96% fresh. What does that mean? It means that critics enjoyed Mutant Mayhem, and sometimes a generally enjoyable film does get a higher tomato meter rating than a more ambitious film like Oppenheimer, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily a better movie or even better received by critics, and that's why I do this chart. Yes, it's nice to know if critics liked a movie, but I think it's much nicer to know how much they liked a movie. And when we look at the options that are available in theaters this weekend, Gran Turismo was originally supposed to open this Friday, but it pushed back its release 2 weeks to allow for more Barbie and Oppenheimer breathing room. It will still be doing some select advanced screenings, so trying to build buzz and word of mouth. So it may still be playing in your local market this weekend, but it will not get a wide release for another 2 weeks. That leaves only The Last Voyage of the Demeter in wide release this weekend. It is the latest Dracula adaptation featuring the Vampire's Voyage to London from Andre Overdahl, director of Troll Hunter and Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. So that is probably the only new movie that's playing in many or most markets around the country. But if you're lucky enough to get some indie films, then there are a lot of other options you can check out. I mentioned The Pod Generation. It stars Emilia Clarke and Chiwetel Ejiofor. They play an expectant couple in a world where babies are now grown in pods. The movie's from Cold Souls writer-director Sophie Barths. Aporia, starring Judy Greer, is opening in limited release. Judy Greer plays a grieving woman who finds that time travel may be able to change the past, but apparently at a price. Also opening in limited release is One and Only. It's been on the highest grossing international charts from China for a couple of weeks, now getting a US release. It kind of looks like a mix between Magic Mike and Step Up, so, might be worth a shot. King Coal is opening in limited release. It's a documentary about the coal industry and its place in modern lives and families. Another documentary opening is The Eternal Memory, about a Chilean TV host struggle with the effects of Alzheimer's disease and how his wife cares for him over a series of years. A24 is distributing a film called Medusa Deluxe about murder at a hairdressing competition. The trailer for this movie looked really interesting. I may try to check it out, probably on VOD, honestly. I don't know if it's going to come to my market. Also available is King on Screen, a documentary about the many film adaptations of Stephen King's books and writings. And then probably in several markets nationwide is Gadar 2. It's reportedly set for an impressive opening gross this weekend in India that is often also visible domestically in our box office figures as well. And that does it for a very long episode of Charts with Dan. They seem to be long lately, but hey, there's a lot to talk about. Trust me, we're all going to be wishing that we had this much to talk about come September. So let's relish in the charts while we can. Don't forget to check out the description below to find out more about our sponsors this week, as well as to find a link to that interview with Brandon Purdy, the VP and Head of Distribution at Angel Studios, about Sound of Freedom. And you can also find information down there about Cameo. I'm doing Cameo now. I've sent out several over the past few weeks. It's been a lot of fun. Joining in on people's birthday celebrations or answering questions or just saying hi. It's really a unique way to interact with people. So if it's something that you might want to do or gift to somebody as part of a birthday or back to school, you can find that information down there as well as a lot more. Thank you so much for spending part of your day here with me. Stay tuned right here on the channel for more movie news, reviews, box office, you name it. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.